You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
All right, hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. This week, I want to take a look at what makes goth culturally unique among its alternative peers, discuss how the flexibility of goth can lead it to fold into other subcultural groupings like punk and metal, as we'll see in the scene from Mexico City. And I want to look at how goth has the ability to adapt to a local environment while still remaining identifiable as part of goth culture. We're going to be reviewing the new album from Living Temples as well, sharing our Sinister Suggestions and more. So as always, I am the Count, and my co-host this month is Trey. Welcome back, Trey.
Thank you, Count. It's good to be back as always.
And our special guest, you may know her from YouTube as Gothic SoulFlower. It's Daz. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate being here.
I like to start the show by asking a little about your origin story and to get kind of the flavor of how you were introduced to alternative or goth culture and, you know, how you, what has kept you with it for so long.
I officially, if there's an official date, officially got into goth about 1994. Before that, I was into alternative, mainly new wave. I like to say my gateway into goth was Depeche Mode,
Nice.
and I don't think I'm alone there.
Yeah.
So, you know, I went to college in Atlanta, and the young lady that got me into goth was a fellow college student. She had seen me around and kind of noticed I was different, and she was different. She invited me to hang out with her, and she started playing The Cure and, you know, Susie Sue, and I immediately dug it, and I've been into it ever since.
I am interested to know a lot. It seems like a lot of YouTubers, probably the majority of YouTubers, don't really have a local scene per se, and the way that they interact with the community is through creating stuff on YouTube and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have like a local goth club or event, or even just like you know, local goths that you can spend time with there, or is it online?
It's mainly online. I think there's one goth club in the city. I'm near Washington D.C. and I live in Maryland, but I'm close to Washington D.C. And then I'm also a little older, so you know, when I got into goth, I was in college. I was around other students who were into the goth scene. And, you know, life goes on, we move away, and now I'm older, and the only goth club I'm aware of is in DC, which I have not been to. So I find goths, we really are scattered. And I think that is a problem. Like you said, a lot of goths that I know have been online. So I'm basically more of a solitary goth, if you will. And yeah, I've just listened to my music, just started back drawing and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, mainly by myself, and sometimes it makes me unhappy, but
well,
it is what it is.
You mentioned you're a little older, but do you feel like that has impact on how you interact with the scene, or like you're not as interested in going out and drinking till 5 a.m, or
it's mainly me. It's I feel myself kind of, this is gonna sound worse than it is, but I kind of find myself a little isolating a bit. I'll go to dinners, but I don't go out as much, and so I could go to a goth club and interact, but I don't know, I feel like I'm getting a little more conservative in my older age, which I don't know how I feel about that, honestly, but it is what it is. So the separation and the fact that I haven't really hung out in the scene, that's on me. I could it's not that I had a problem with the scene or anything. I've just grown a little more isolated
Yeah.
lately.
I do think that's pretty common, even for myself, even for a lot of people that, being near Chicago, a lot of the Chicago goths even are just more introverted. A lot of us have anxiety issues and just kind of
Right.
don't necessarily feel comfortable in a large group. And so that kind of thing,
Yeah.
even when I was younger and I wouldn't say I had anxiety issues, it was just always part of the thing that we're all you can assume everyone's going to be awkward except for the few like extroverts, and we're just going to kind of sit
Right.
around and look at our shoes, and so that for me that's always been like part of the thing.
Totally. Well, I think the gentrifying of a lot of cities, a lot of creative people cannot afford it here anymore in DC. And I mean, it's not the entire reason, but a lot of the creative people have moved away. I mean, it's that simple.
Yeah.
And I think it hasn't helped. Maybe it's not a reason, but it hasn't helped, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Did you listen to the episode, I think it was a month or so back, with Leah Bush, the Aging in Gothic Spaces?
I did not. I missed that
I
one.
recommend checking it out. Her main
Okay.
focus, where her research is being done, is in Baltimore and related to the Baltimore
Oh,
goth
okay.
scene explicitly.
Uh-huh.
And she does speak a lot about how that scene seems to be very welcoming to older goths and has a very sort of chilled back vibe that, at least some of their clubs, and she name dropped a couple of places that you might have an interest in. But some of their
Okay.
clubs do cater more towards, older goths in their 30s, 40s. And so,
Okay.
who just, they sit around and listen to the music and enjoy the atmosphere. It's less about the sort of young, go out and dance and drink and hook up, that kind of thing.
Well,
So,
that sounds quite lovely, actually. So I will definitely check that out.
It's funny, some of the people we've got a couple people in chat, and they are also saying similar things, that they got into the music when they were older, like around in the early 90s when they were in their 20s, and that was an interesting experience for them. Just sort of not, the typical baby bat thing is you're 15,
Sure.
you're emo for a little while, and then you're
Yeah.
like a hot topic goth or whatever. But
Right.
the,
And that's so funny because I kind of missed all that. When all
yeah.
that was going on, I've been in the workforce. I was still a goth, but I had to kind of tone it down a bit, during those years. So the emo and hot topic, I knew that was going on, but I wasn't really. It just I just didn't pay attention to it. So it's interesting to hear what's been going on in between when I first got in goth and more recently.
All right. If you guys are ready, we'll go ahead and jump into the news.
If this boy did this and the gothic, stuff that went around it and the motive and everything, don't we all sort of want to know, that could be our teenager, that could be our kid doing that? How could that possibly happen?
Being described as being involved with the goth movement, but what exactly is that? We kind of know it when we see it, but some aspects of a goth lifestyle could they provoke such a murder?
All right, cool. So our article this month is titled "Mexico City's Coolest Style Subculture Embraces Everyone as Long as You're Wearing Black." Some people will tell you that the internet killed style subcultures, or at least turned them into a global, universally acceptable phenomenon. We say that's bullshit. Even as the world is shrinking, there are still truly unique groups out there, men and women doing precisely their own thing in their own place in a way that can't be replicated elsewhere, and we wanted to find them. Das, I'm kind of interested, actually, since you were getting into, you said 94, so that's
You're right.
Around when the internet was still in its infancy. Certainly we didn't have stuff like Facebook or that kind of thing. Do you have any opinions on how the ubiquity of the internet has changed or impacted subculture or goth specifically?
I know some of us may complain about this, but the thing with the internet is, the good news is you have all these goths that's able to communicate across countries. I mean, literally, around the world.
Yeah.
However, the downside is that a lot of it is about looks and fashion, and I don't know if that should even change. I mean, the internet, it's a visual medium. And I personally like the style. But, it's in the 90s with any subculture, really, you were face to face. I mean, you built a community around people since there was no internet, that you had no choice. So it's bittersweet in a way. I do like that a group of more goths are aware that we do exist, and a lot of us are still around. However, as I was reading this article, actually, one thing that made me happy is they do hang out in person and have built a community, and it reminds me of the 90s. You go listen to music, hang out, and call it a night if you want.
It does seem to me more and more over the years that the internet goth community and the cities that have an actual scene, like the bigger cities, have become like increasingly separated from one another. That the sort of debates or complaints or things that are talked about online are less and less kind of reflecting what is happening in local scenes. Just because the people that are, even if you live in Chicago, if you're more inclined to stay home anyway, staying on the internet is much easier access, and that has kind of become its own, I don't know, microbiome or something. So it seems a little, Trey, I don't know how you feel about that, but it seems like it's more and more separating from the experience of a goth in a local scene.
So how I kind of see that is one of the things that the internet, it's great boon as well as its great bane to this sort of cultural thing, is the fact that because you have such a wide access to so many different people and so many different interests, it's easy to build a community around a very narrow focus. You don't have to.
True.
I mean, in the real world, in the 90s, in the 80s, goth clubs, the goth scene was much more open because you went to the only place you could really get anything that you wanted. And that happened to also be a shared space with many other people with different interests and different ideas. And there was a little bit more of a sharing of a cultural idea without being so specific in, you must look just like this, you must like just these 3 bands. Whereas in the internet age, you can easily find and create a community that's very specific in their interests. And it creates a very interesting siloing effect. And that's why we have all these different, the whole blossoming of subgenres and subgenres of goth and gothic style and gothic culture that's so very specific. And that's one of the things that the internet did. It didn't bring everybody together in the sort of utopian sense that it was kind of advertised as when it came out. It did bring lots of people together, but still we like to gather into our little tribes, and it's helped us create these tribes in ever more specific ways.
Right. I agree with that. And I think also it's when you're solitary, you don't really get to hang out much. It's easy to just focus on the internet, where I feel as if you're with the tribe in person, you'll be on the internet, social media and all that, but your focus is with the people around you. So again, it's that good part of internet, it's like, oh, I didn't even know this existed. And the bad part is like, well, wish we could hang out, which you can, but if you're in a different country, it might be a little more tricky. So
yeah, I guess that's a good point too, is when social bonds are so powerful that if you initially make them online and your group of friends that are really close happen to be all over the planet, you're going to want to stay there. Whereas like if they happen to be within a 10-mile radius, then of course you guys would all go out and get involved with the scene, but it can still be this kind of, it can still feel isolating when your friends that you've made online aren't, there to come over and say, hey, let's get dressed together. Let's, motivate each other to go out, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. Because, when I'm ready to go out, they could be in another country getting ready to go to work in the morning. I mean, that's the wider the net, it's harder to negotiate when you want to even chat or whatever. So that's part of the challenge as well.
Yeah.
And then also, as has been mentioned a couple times, the prevalence of degrees of social anxiety or just difficulties with groups and crowds. Back when the only way to find that society that accepted you or that could be with you to give you the sense that you're not alone was by going out and seeing them, then there was this pressure to not want to be alone. So you would force yourself out of your comfort zone. You would force yourself to go out and through that immersion, hopefully, be able to dial back some of those anxieties. Whereas now, if you can establish that community in a safe space through the internet, there's no real strong push to break out of that comfort zone and try to, reach out and do things that you might not be otherwise comfortable with. And I think it's making it easier for people to stay in and, just find that culture that way, for better and for worse.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
All right, let's see here. Nicholas Zamora is a fresh-faced punk in Mexico City. At 22, he's part of a new crop in a long lineage of anti-establishment subcultures, defined as much by their aesthetics as the bands they listen to, the art they create, and their forms of political protest. In this city of over 25 million people, sprawling satellite neighborhoods included, there is a roving cast of punks, goths, new wavers, new romantics, industrial freaks, and metaleros united in creating resistance by stylized expression. So, obviously, at least to me, I think punk and goth have two very different outlooks on culture. And I think punk is much more concerned with politics and sticking it to the man and that kind of thing. But Das, I'm interested to hear, we have an episode coming up on this, so I'd love to get your take on it. Do you perceive goth as being purposefully political or anti-establishment or that kind of thing, or does it stay out of that?
I think goth generally stays away from it, and not deliberately. And it's also I think goth it's more of an individualistic style or subculture, especially these days. I just think punks and anti-establishment just go together. It's kind of where it all started, even goth. But for some reason, goth was a little more political when I started, and that's because we were together. It wasn't just us goths. It was basically freaks versus the normals. So you had skaters, hippies, metalheads. We just all hung together. And if you're already in a group and you're already disenfranchised, we were political that way, not under a banner of goth or punk. It was just, we were just outsiders, basically. So it got a little political then, but nowadays I don't think goth, I think politics, it doesn't really mix with the goth. As far as what I've seen, it can, but I haven't seen it lately.
Do you think that goes back to the internet thing, where because it's so globalized that there's not as much of a focus on the local, politics or the local people on the street that give you shit every day when you go out with your friends, kind of thing?
Part of it too is, I don't know, I feel goth has gotten pretty. It's not a bad thing. I mean, if you've seen my style, I do love the prettiness of it. I think goth has really it's trying to get more and more into style. And I think that's the problem, because when it's focused on style, I mean, if we're competing with style of music, then politics, especially in this climate, a lot of people are just sick of politics in general. So I'm not. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think maybe a move away from DIY culture has been part of that, or is that not related? Because there's the whole big mess of all the shops selling cheap goth clothing and the Instagram shilling for a kill star or whatever it is kind of thing.
Right.
Do you think that because DIY obviously came out of punk, and it did have some of that spirit?
I think it's a factor. I don't think it's think it's a big reason. I think, in my opinion, I think a lot of it is time. I mean, it's great to sew a whole new piece or even to change an outfit, but it's kind of in competition with just going somewhere and clicking a button and here it is. And so it's unfortunate that I think the DIY has kind of taken a backseat these days. But it's so easy. I online shop. I know how it is, man.
That's a good.
And I don't sew, so
There's also,
you can still make it to your own, but DIY. I think a big part of it's time.
There's also the big change in fashion between 70s and 80s when goth first started and today, which is much more disposable fashion. It's much easier to get all sorts of things very cheaply on a relative point of view. And a lot of the DIY ethic came from necessity. It came from, lower and middle class folks, which is what the core of the original punks and then post-punks and goths sort of came out of. And you DIY'd because you could only afford to get that thing at the thrift shop and to scrawl on it with some spray paint or chalk or whatever you had available to you. So there was a lot of that necessity, where now, with our ever more globalized economy, we can get cheap knockoffs that look really nice from China or South America or wherever they happen to have the sweatshop of the day. So it's very easy to get that sort of style aesthetic without having to pay the high street prices that you would have had to do it in style in the 70s and 80s.
Right. And also, in the early days, I mean, and this is just a result of time gone by. Not all parents these days accept any dark subculture, but a lot more do than my parents. We couldn't just, hey, Mom, can I get this? Even if they can afford it, a lot of parents are like, no, what are you doing? So a lot more parents, I think, are more accepting. And a lot of that is the internet and just time, because there's goths my age and they have children and they are grown now. So I think that's part of it shocking as well.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
And thanks to Nephilim in the Patreon chat for bringing up the DIY point.
Oh, nice.
Let's move on here. The group is comprised of a diverse cabal of individuals who funnel into and fracture along even more specific musical genres. But generally, they're called darks here. And unlike in other cities where marginal differences in style or sound can create real social divisions, the darks are surprisingly inclusive, taking all comers, provided they're suitably alternative. Born out of the music genre that continues to define it, the Goth-Punk scene started as somewhat of a lag from its inception in the mid-1970s in Great Britain and the United States, which trickled into Mexico in the late 70s and gained steam in the 1980s. It held sway through the 90s and continues to evolve, picking up reference points along the way. Honestly, that doesn't really scream inclusion to me. I mean, of course, there's the discussion around, do we gatekeep people who don't dress in a goth aesthetic? But at least from my experience, when it comes to club nights, I think it generally is the case that as long as it's black and weird, you're part of the club. So I don't know that I've necessarily seen instances of marginal aesthetic differences creating social divisions, like they said in the first part of that. I mean, maybe something like cyber goth or steampunk, but I think those are pretty starkly different. But I don't know. Have you guys seen? And I think it's certainly different online. But have you seen? What did they say? Social divisions in goth because of style differences.
And see, I have not experienced that. I think the divisions I've noticing is online. But as far as in real life, I mean, you have people who are just above it all. They consider them uber goths, but they really were. They weren't common. Most of us luckily just thought they were ridiculous, and it was more of a risk to do that in real life than online. So the division was there, but it wasn't big in my experience. It was just kind of certain people, but they weren't the majority, at least in my experience.
Yeah, in my experience, I find more of the social division comes primarily from scene drama and just the idea of cliques within the scenes where, there's certain groups of friends and they hang out at the club, and then there's another group, and the two don't really interact. They sometimes go to the same clubs, but sometimes they, this group of people goes to these groups of clubs, and this group of people goes to this other group of clubs. And, in Chicago, we have some of that choice. So there can be some of those divisions. Whereas when I was, in smaller scenes and we only had, the one club night, all of the little cliques would all go to the same club, but they still, they'd all be there, but some people would be, this is the group that hangs out in the beer garden. This is the group that hangs out in the bar area. This is the group that hangs out over here. And again, they still don't really interact. But I've not seen that. That's simply just group dynamics. That's not really an idea that they're being divided by differences in general aesthetic or sound or musical preferences. And I personally find that the Chicago scene, at least, is pretty inclusive of different, musical styles and ideas, as well as aesthetic dresses. There's definitely a lot of sort of a metal undercurrent to a lot of the goth scene here, but we've got plenty of industrial kids. We've got plenty of punks, a not insignificant number of probably emo type or new wave specialty types. And then you've got some that go to some of the specialty nights, like the ones who would more likely go to a shimmer or, something that's a little bit more ethereal and swoopy, shoegaze, rather than someone who'd be going to Medusa's or something like that. That's a little bit more, hey, this is the hard dance stuff.
The real drama happens when we start fucking each other, but that's a whole different story.
Well, that's true across all cultures.
It's true. Yeah, right. That always gets messy.
Literally and figuratively. All right. No, there has been a lot of drama centering around relationships recently.
Yeah, I'm
online and in not just in Chicago, but like a lot of my online goth friends are like going through really nasty breakups.
Yeah,
which it always ends up dragging it because the pool of friends is so small. It's always involving people taking sides and stuff like that.
It is. That's the problem with being in a relatively small and insular community. You're hanging out with the same people, and that means your dating pool is generally the same people. And when things go down negatively in a relationship, that just kind of shatters out through the whole community, and there's fracture lines everywhere. And depending on how seriously people take things, it causes problems.
All right. So where are we at? Here we go. When punk and its progeny have petered out in their cities of origin, they grew roots in others. Mexico City, where poverty, violence, and corruption are daily realities for the populace, is fertile ground for modes of expression that combat the grind and urban ennui. So while studded belts and mohawks are now passé in some global cities, aesthetic presentations take on new meaning here in CDMX. The Goth-Punk lifestyle is, seemingly, felt and lived harder here, functioning as a creative outlet as well as a structure of support. Equally important, the scene provides places to listen to music, to dance, to flirt, to drink and have a good fucking time. In other words, an understandable reason to spend 3 hours doing your hair.
Basically, it sounds like Mexico City is kind of reviving the old like Manchester scene, and some of those old original goth scenes with a very underclass, downtrodden, dealing with the urban ennui and all of that.
Ennui, thank you. I knew I pronounced that wrong.
It's all right. I think our listeners are. Isn't that one of the drinking games too?
If I pronounce it wrong or say something that no one understands what I'm talking about, we'll go with that. And thinking about that, I was wondering what your take on the alternative style element of that, in that for them it functions as that kind of punk resistance and that kind of outward expression of anger at culture and anger at the system. And I'm curious if you feel like we have kind of lost that, or perhaps it's taken on a different meaning, or maybe it's something else altogether.
Just like Trey said, I agree with him. This is very reminiscent of Manchester and fighting against the establishment. I mean, the appearance itself is, they weren't trying to look pretty and all that. I think it seems to me now, and it may be because of my age, my style is really fitting of my lifestyle, and that includes my job. Versus, I mean, I might be fighting establishment, but if I'm working at a job with a boss, there's only so much I am able to do. I think the reasoning is just different. I'm not this young, angry person fighting against establishment. My fight against establishment now is, it's underhanded and sneaky, and it's not obvious, and I don't appear angry, and I may dress strange, but it's not really shocking at this point, and that's fine. I just think the reasoning is different. It's you're fitting your individual lifestyle versus fighting as a group against, poverty, violence, and corruption. A lot of Americans haven't really dealt with that lately, as far as a country. They do in their communities, but as a country, we're not war torn at this time. We're kind of just dealing with different things that may not be pressing on your life.
Yeah, I agree. I think the main difference here is just a different relationship that the alternative subculture in Mexico City has in relation to the general mainstream culture in Mexico City, compared to how the alternative subcultures in the U.S. have to contend with the mainstream culture in the U.S. And it's similar to, I don't remember what episode it was several episodes ago, talking about some of the complaints that older goths have about the younger goths, and it's about how it's so easy now to acquire things, or to dress weird, to dye your hair, to have all sorts of piercings, because that battle has already been fought. In the 70s and 80s, the goths and punks of that era fought the battle and shed the blood to let people spike their hair and dye it all sorts of crazy colors and wear all the black and leather and all this stuff that was decidedly not acceptable back then has become more acceptable. So even though people now are at least somewhat wearing the same sort of things, it's not as much of a struggle. People just sort of see it, oh, it's another one of them doing their thing. It's not as much of an affront on society, where Mexico City is still a relatively conservative culture as far as the mainstream is concerned. And so when you go out dressed in a way that, if I walked around in Chicago dressed a certain way, if I did that in Mexico City, it would be much more of an affront to the other people there. And that could lead to, violence and problems with police, problems with gangs, problems with all sorts of things. So even if you're not expressly political, if you're not doing it to, kick back at the man, just by doing it to express your individuality, you're in an environment that it becomes more of a political statement, or at least you're taking a risk.
Yeah, I agree.
There was a recent article on the LA goth scene that a mutual friend of ours, Zachary, was featured in, or at least in the photo. And at one point, towards the end of the article, they interview the guy who runs Cloak and Dagger in LA. I think his name is Bravin or something like that. And he expressed that for him, or not really even for him, just his opinion on goth as a whole, that it was never about music, but all about aesthetic, which is absolutely ridiculous to me. But he didn't even say that like the aesthetic had a meaning behind it other than just to be pretty. And that, I mean, I went on a whole like hour rant on our what was it called? The curse of internet celebrity. I went on a rant about that. But I think I mean there are people like that, but I have two problems with that. I mean, first of all, it's too reductionist. I don't like this idea of pinning the entirety of goth culture to one thing, one phenomena, and the not having the depth behind the fashion. I think the nice thing, and what we're seeing with the difference in Mexico City and here in America, is that I think the elements of goth fashion are flexible. So while I think in general there is substance and meaning behind the look, for one person, it can be a reflection of an individual identity. For another, it can function as that sort of provocation space, the discursive space that is trying to get a reaction and challenge cultural norms. It can be an expression of music history, and it can also just be something that looks cool. You know, and in this case in Mexico City, that's being read as this sort of resistance to the local cultural climate and ecology. But
it's the way the culture is going. Like I said, you know, with the internet and style and all that, it's a very visual medium. And I don't see an issue with putting fashion above everything else. My issue was I just it's a music if it's a music subculture, it has to be based on music, and this is what gives the subculture substance. Fashion, by its very definition, it's fleeting, it's trendy. It's not everyone can wear the same fashion at the same time. So my concern is if it's left with aesthetics, what's the line between criticizing your clothes and criticizing your weight, criticizing maybe your skin tone or the way you do your hair? Because now we're clearly in aesthetics, and there's no, in my opinion, no substance to that. So I feel losing the substance, which for me is the music. I think it would turn the subculture even more shallow. And that's my opinion. And there's people who disagree with that. But, you know, even if you don't put the music at the top, it's got to be included. That's my opinion. And the good news is, you know, people think you have to listen to the same type of goth music. There's just so much out there. There's just going on YouTube. There's groups from the 90s I've never heard of. It's amazing. So I could see if it was only one or two choices of music, but that's just not the case.
Yeah.
There also can be an issue with cultural transference when it comes to the quote unquote substantive aspects of music, when you're dealing with certain just styles or genres of music that have a resonance with, you know, the point of origin or the cultural history that led to that style, or lyrical themes when it comes to cultural references and touchstones, you know, reaching back to, you know, previous incarnations that goth would reach back to, some Victorian literature or
Right.
stuff like that doesn't always translate between cultures real well. One thing really interesting with this that I don't know if it dovetails because it wasn't really established in this article or wasn't at least addressed directly, but concepts around death and morbidity have a very strong resonance within Western society coming out of the Victorian era, and we harken back to that sort of Victorian ideas towards death and morbidity, and mourning clothes and all that stuff is one of the major touchstones for goth. However, the attitude and relationship with death in Mexican culture, especially coming out of the native Central American populations, the Aztec and the Maya, and some of those groups which fed into the predominant mestizo culture now, doesn't have as much of, I guess, an aversion towards death, a privacy towards death. It's a very celebratory and a very different experience. So when you've got these musical themes or lyrical themes that really require a stronger understanding of that sort of Western idea of those themes, when it tries to translate to a culture that doesn't share that underlying idea, it becomes harder for those substantive things to translate. Whereas some of the fashion aspects of it can translate pretty easily, or at least can be relatively easily aped. If you like the way it looks, you can emulate it, you can have that look and have it as a style. And as a supplement to this, when I first saw some of Daniel's notes about this episode and about, different cultures and their stuff, I looked up some other culture things. And I just want to read a quick little paragraph from an article comparing Japanese goth to Western goth. And it's saying, in Japan, the Gothic symbols such as the crucifix, even images of morbidity, mourning, don't have the same cultural resonance that they do in the West. They don't share the same background of Christianity, the Victorian age, and everything that came with that culture. Everything is taken at face value. You'll see people wearing very elaborate, elegant Gothic outfits. In Japan, there's more detail put into the creation of the outfit. For example, you might see intricate lace, you might see Gothic Lolita. In the West, you'll see a lot more casual goth. It's the general American goth that you would imagine: t-shirt, dark pants, pleather, PVC. It doesn't have the same resonance as the Japanese Gothic scene, where that's saying that, some of those substantive elements don't resonate, but the aesthetic ones do. So they really go all out on the aesthetic. And that's one of the potential issues or struggles with as you transition from very distant cultures, historically speaking.
That was exactly where I was going to go next, actually, Trey. And so I'm just going to skip that part of the article and talk about it because you kind of read my mind. I was actually going to ask you, Das. It seems like you, for your own personal style, that you you kind of mix like goth aesthetic with the belly dancer stuff and some other things. So when it comes to that, I guess, variety of part of a goth look, what, how do you retain the integrity from different cultures when you're trying to put that together? And where do you draw the line as far as when we get into stuff that gets a lot of criticism, like pastel goth and metal fashion and cyber goth and that kind of thing?
Even bringing belly dance, like the skirts, that's a main staple that I wear in my goth attire, brought over from belly dance. And just the fact that it's black versus bright colors, there's already a separation there. So that and the jewelry, heavy jewelry, kind of more of this, I don't like to use the term gypsy, but that type of style going on. Now, another big part of my style does come from history. Basically 100 years from now, I like a lot of style from the 20s. I like long skirts, and the silhouette, I do pick that up from Edwardian fashion back in the day. Just the being smaller at the top and having a long skirt, and I even have Victorian boots. I've went from shocking and showing my skin to I'm pretty covered up most of the time. And I do like that kind of, I call it shadow dressing. Basically, I'm just this mob of black with maybe some metal touches here and there. And I do a lot of peekaboo stuff and show my skin through lace. But I mainly incorporate belly dance makeup and skirts, and then the silhouette, including the jackets, I take a lot from the early 20th century. I like the coverage and the silhouette. And then I just kind of play with all that, somehow put it together.
And Trey, going back to what you were saying about Japanese culture, I just watched this, I don't know if you could call it a documentary, but this video today about a goth culture. And it basically did that thing where they conflate the gothic with goth culture, which is something I see generally happening more with the academic community. But I do think it did sort of come out of the, in the 90s, there was that massive romantic goth scene, which I think is kind of where it gave rise to that idea that goth has been around for hundreds of years, and people like Poe and Baudelaire and Horace Walpole were goths, which I don't think is the case. But it's interesting when we have this hyper focus on, especially in this video I just watched, I'll put a link in the show notes, but this hyper focus on marrying the modern goth culture to Gothic literature and Gothic architecture becomes a problem when I run into it, because it creates this inherently flawed framework through which people try to understand goth, and it misses out on how goth culture draws inspiration from a lot of different places, with like Gothic literature just being one of them. And then it misses out on what I think is the filter that goth uses to take these inspirations, like you were saying for belly dance, making it black. We kind of take these inspirations and put them through our own like philosophical filter to see what they are goth, what makes them goth. And a problem with that I run into is this focus on Eastern European culture being the like locus, the foundation of goth, has lent itself to this idea that what is like uber goth is basically white, and that the foundational ideologies from Eastern Europe, and then the musicians of the UK that are these wafy white guys, leads to this notion that goth is sort of this Eastern European culture, which is a huge problem. Like, I think goth does function as a sort of constructed family lineage, or even like some kind of fantasy ethnicity. But when we're marrying these notions to a European cultural lineage, like if we keep on the Gothic, what goth takes from the Gothic, capital Gothic, is like the themes, the uncanny, the monstrous. At the time, there was this subversion of the kind of puritanical, male-dominated society, the avant-garde, the theatricality, the philosophy of morbidity and the human condition and that kind of thing. So we take that out of the Gothic, but we get that from a lot of places, not just from Gothic literature. And then we, like I mentioned, we kind of distort it through the filter of what becomes recognizably goth culture. So I think this conflation of the UK post-punk scene with these dead white guys that wrote all this amazing literature, being the idea that is what goth is, has lent to what we're trying to change now, which is this idea that the face of goth is white in all of our advertising and all of the modeling. And I have never thought that was meant to be the spirit of goth culture, but it led to these kind of unaddressed issues, I think, that we're just trying to figure out now.
Well, I think that is one positive of the internet now. You do see people from different cultures being part of the goth subculture and incorporating their style, because darkness, death, and all that's universal. And it's death is expressed, or is there's different beliefs and different cultures revolve about that. But I can see, I am glad to be getting away from, there's still this idea that goth is white only. And to be fair, it did start that way because it was born in England and it was born in Europe as far as the subculture, and the singers and the bands, they were inspired by Gothic literature and death, and that was part of English culture too. So I see where that belief comes from. And I think one good thing these days is you are seeing people who aren't white, who are just as goth as anyone else. But it does come from somewhere as far as goth equals white person.
Yeah.
Not the case, but it was born in England. And
I mean, Trey, you can probably speak to this better than me, but there was, coming out of the punk scene, there was a huge amount of minority and people of color making music in the punk scene. The problem is, I think, that we have this sort of revisionist history in a way that we don't really talk about those bands or those musicians. And so that's just kind of how we think it happened.
Oh, yeah. I was just actually going to make that point. Coming back, if you look back at the origin in the UK, those were very, very diverse communities. The whole post-punk movement was, punk itself in its inception, yes, there was a lot of, but that was harkening back to the old garage rock days and tended a little bit more to be more exclusive to the white middle class. But it was still pretty egalitarian. But then what happened to lead on to post-punk was a huge influx of I think it was an African diaspora as well as some coming out of the Caribbean, because it was a huge reggae influence that came in, and that was where a lot of post-punk got its drive from. That's what brought the bass to the front as a melodic instrument in the music, which was definitely not the case in punk. It's one of the hallmarks going on to post-punk. So there was a lot of influences from diverse cultures and a lot of diversity in that early scene. And I think it's more a development through the late 80s, maybe into the 90s, where a lot of that erasure happened and they forgot about the importance of immigrant communities in the inception of all of post-punk, including goth. And it became more of an idea that, you just paint your face white and the major bands are all white and it must be a white thing. But there were certainly some early bands that had more diverse casts of members, but inclusion within those communities was still limited, but it wasn't nearly as stark as it sort of came to be perceived in the 90s and leading on to today.
Right. That's a good point, actually. And it was a good reminder, actually, particularly the reggae and punk and, then ska and all that. So good reminder.
Yeah, that did remind me, actually, that postpunk.com just did an interview with David J. from Bauhaus, and he mentioned that a massive influence on the type of music that Bauhaus made was reggae, because he said there was a huge scene in England at the time, and that was a lot of the type of music and clubs that the people were going to. And he was saying a lot of their music was influenced by that and was meant to incorporate that.
Well, absolutely.
And that was a big part of the scene.
Bela Lugosi's Dead is a straight up dub track. There's no question about that. It's a straight up dub track. And then they also have a couple of tracks on some of those early albums that are, they call them dub, but they made a dub version of various songs. On I think Mask has a track, I don't remember which it is. It's something dub, but definitely had a lot of that influence in early Bauhaus and a lot of that early scene.
All right, let's finish up. Let's just do one little part here, and then we'll go on to the album. Let's see. His girlfriend, Nayeli.
Nayeli.
Yeah, there we go.
I think it's Nayeli.
She shops at the city's historic open-air markets, which are held in specific neighborhoods throughout the city on certain days. These local bazaars have sections that specialize in piles of used, dirt cheap clothes that residents dig through to find wearable pieces. There's also El Chapo, a Saturday-only punk market that sells newly pressed Cramps t-shirts, hair dye, studs, and CDs. About the closest thing to a Hot Topic you'll find in Mexico City. Despite its cheery capitalist feel nowadays, the market has been running for decades and was once a focal point for political action. It still acts as a meeting point for all stripes of alternative subsets where vendors hawk small press publications and zines, disseminate anarchist literature, and hand out vegan tortas in the bright light of day. And that does sound a lot like some of the markets in early England back in the 80s. But
yeah, that sounds lovely.
Yeah. I wanted to, from there, I wanted to tease out this idea of commodification, though, and kind of get your takes on this, because this has become a recurring topic, but the idea that in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, whenever you want to say it was, that broader culture started packaging and selling our clothing back to us, and that some people now, actually a book just came out, the author argues that goth culture is continuing to be commodified, and eventually it's in danger of disappearing because it is being taken over by capitalism and that kind of thing.
I could see that happening, but I feel like this has happened before. They take, because a lot of marketing is geared towards teenagers and young adults. So anything that's seen as edgy, I think that they're going to commodify that because it's all about money. But I think it's fleeting. I can't help but feel like they're going to see something else, and then that'll grab the attention. At least that's how it used to be. Of course, you can have different things going on at the same time. So I'm not concerned, but I don't know if I should be.
Yeah, I think it's not really something to be concerned of in the degree, or to the degree that as a consumer who also considers yourself part of the Gothic subculture, think about where you're getting what you're getting. Think about the provenance of your aesthetic, and pay attention to that, because it takes two people for a commodification to lead to subcultural erasure, or two organizations. You have the industry or capitalist hegemony, however you want to put it, that's commodifying and packaging and selling the stuff, but you also have the subcultural insiders who can choose to buy the stuff or choose to continue doing their own thing. And we've had this sort of commodification always, and fashion is very ephemeral. It happened in the 70s for punk fashion, as well as the sort of witchy pagan commodification that happened heavily in the 70s.
Yep.
That didn't seem to erase anything. We still have plenty of that today, and that's not popular anymore.
It's back.
Exactly.
Right.
The 80s, the new wave fashions, the adamant styles, those were totally commodified in the 80s. Didn't do anything to erase it. It was convenient at the time. People could get clothes easily, but then flash in the pan, it moved on. Happened in the 90s again, sort of with the Gothic aesthetic. Again, focusing more on the pagan and witchy aspect of it. Thank you to the craft. And that didn't erase anything there either. The same aesthetic has popped back up again, and we call it New Goth now. So, I mean, we've got this constant cycling and recycling of products, and fashion is so flash in the pan, ephemeral. They jump on a bandwagon. It's good for a season, but next season they've got something else. And unless the subculture decides to fold and, not continue doing their own thing, it's got no danger of being supplanted by this commodification.
I also think the good news is, even if you are purchasing everything, I think a lot of goths are still into, even if you don't do DIY, you're still going to try to make it your own. By the time you get a dress and you see the modeling on Amazon, where I get a lot of my clothes. But by the time I put it on, add accessories, whatever you want, it can be a completely different look. So I can see the commodification being of a concern, but about many goths are just creative. They rarely just. I haven't seen them just wear some directly off the rack. We gotta add stuff. We gotta fix it around, and you can really make it your own. So I think that's gonna help it be. That's gonna help against just buying things and just wearing it exactly how everyone else is.
Right.
So
And
that's
there's all
something
kinds of
to
ways to
keep in mind.
do that, right? You've got the DIY aesthetic. That's the pure one, where you're just taking very raw materials and you're totally crafting them into this own thing that truly expresses your personality. But as Das mentioned earlier, not everyone's got time for that, and there is this time trade-off between time and convenience. And I know my style, I don't do DIY at all, really, but I do a lot of separates. I don't buy outfits. I buy pieces.
Right.
I buy a coat, a shirt, pants, skirts, whatever, and I mix and match them, put them together, and I'll make new outfits. And I try to do that, anytime I go out. I'll try to, what combination haven't I done before? So I mean, that's kind of my style, and mine is almost all off the rack stuff, but it's mix and match separates rather than I bought an outfit and I wear it like a costume.
Right.
I think I agree. I do think it's something to be mindful of, but I guess what I look to for markers of cultural health are like, do we still have our own micromedia? I'll be, unless I die or can't pay the bills anymore, this podcast is still going to be around. Do we have bands that are producing music, independent artists and independent record labels? I think the fashion is a bit trickier because I think where in the past we had places like Forever 21 would do like a goth kind of thing. And yeah, sure, some goths would go and buy pieces maybe and like make it their own, but we still had a lot of independent designers. I think now though, it's a little different because we're seeing this influx of places that are like Killstar, not as big as Killstar, but very similar styles, very cheap, and these kind of small pop-up sites. And it seems like they are having an impact on independent goth designers who are making quality stuff. So I am a little concerned about that. But overall, I think the health of goth is okay. And it is, like you said, it is a cyclical kind of thing.
And as a counterpoint to that, we also have things like Etsy and eBay and Amazon Marketplace where people are, small shops, mom and pop places just making their own styles and selling them directly.
That's what I was thinking of, though, was Etsy. I do feel like there are fewer goth Etsy shops than there used to be. And maybe that's just what I'm seeing. Maybe I'm completely off on that. But it seems like they have been pushed out to a degree. But I mean, I don't keep up on it too much, so I could just be completely off base. I don't know.
I doubt they've been pushed out, but when it comes to a small shop that doesn't know how to manage SEO and manage their presence to such a way that they're easily found, unless you know exactly what you're looking for, it gets buried amongst the glut. And certainly the larger companies, who do have a presence on Etsy as well, have more clout and marketing savvy.
They have a budget for marketing.
Exactly. To drown the casual search. So, I mean, it still is harder to find the smaller shops, and that is unfortunate. But they're still out there. They're still producing. The means of distribution is still there. It's just like it's always been, to find the unique stuff still takes work, even with the internet making it quote unquote easier.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I do agree with that. And I do my outfit videos. Because I do believe in supporting small artists. So I am on Etsy quite a bit. My wallet's not happy, but I am on Etsy quite a bit. I get my dread jewelry there. I get other jewelry there. And they're not, some of them aren't goth shops, but they sell a lot of dark gothy items. Like I'll buy jewelry that's made of bones. And I do try to include that when I'm showing what I'm wearing, just to let people know that, hey, look, these shops exist. This is where I got it. And I paired it with this plain old black dress from Amazon.
Yeah, that's so important. It's because I mean that's how we found out about stuff in the old days. Was someone you would you would give your zine to somebody, or you would tell them about a
Right.
thing, or hey, give them a flyer. And I feel like now sometimes people assume because the internet is you have such easy access to everything that people can find it. But it is really important to if you get something cool from an independent designer that's
Right.
quality, like tell people about it. Let them know.
Right. Exactly. And let them know it, you know what? Yeah, I did pay $150 for this jacket, but this was made. I
Mm.
feel like, it's easy to find a ready-made jacket for $150. That for a jacket, it's really easy to find that. So when I find someone who can make a jacket, and I'm short, so length is very important to me. That's important. Yeah, it was $150, but if it's something that's going to last, it's not that much money. I mean, if you have to save for it, it's better, in my opinion, to save for something that's made versus maybe a ready-made item that won't last as long.
You have to buy it every year or two.
Right. And to be fair, that's where I'm at life. When I was in my 20s, I cared more about quantity versus quality. I wasn't going to pay $100 for a pair of shoes. I wanted them for $20, and I got them. Didn't last. They don't exist anymore, but that's just where I was at in those days. So I'm looking for. I shop for quality now, and not everyone's shopping for quality. They may not like it at the end of the day later on. So.
Yeah, and I think one thing.
Junkyard Bat
Go on.
Real quick. Junkyard Bat in the Patreon chat said he's replacing his bed sheets, and he's gonna make the old ones into a shredded poncho, which is super fucking rad.
That sounds awesome. Wow.
Go ahead, Trey.
Yeah, what I was going to say is I think Das, your interactions and in membership in the ATS community probably helps a lot of that too, because I'm involved in some of the local belly dance scene here, and do have a number of friends who do ATS, and I've been to several conventions, and it's great going to the conventions. They always have this great vendor room with all these little shops of people just making their handmade scarves and Wings of Isis and skirts and all these pieces that you can definitely include in a Gothic ensemble, because yes, the majority of them are going to be brightly colored, but they always have some somber pieces, some blacks and purples and reds, and you can pick and choose that, and then get cards from these people, and they'll happily adjust for your size, make custom things for you. They're usually good quality. So the belly dance community definitely has a lot of this. It's kind of what I think goth should look towards, this idea of a very close-knit community where everyone's sharing their crafts, and it has shops and resources, and everyone's sharing, oh, this is where I got that great skirt, and this is where I got those great leggings. And seeing some of that being brought into the goth community would, I think, be a really good thing.
Right. And I like the dance community too, because we are different heights and sizes, and they already, most of them take that into account. And, a lot of it's good because I wear a size extra large, and a lot of these companies think I'm tall, and that is just not the case. So, they have that in mind that, hey, we can shorten this, or we have a 35-inch inseam for you. So that's really nice. And it is easy to incorporate basic pieces into a Gothic wardrobe. Absolutely.
Album review.
Okay, this month we are reviewing the new album from the band Living Temples, which is titled Against the Day. I could not find any information on this band other than that they're from Berlin. So I looked at their website and their Facebook page and their Bandcamp page, but they didn't seem to have a bio anywhere. So what we will do is play a track from their album, and I'm going to play There's Nothing for You There Anymore. Yeah, for me, I mean, I didn't know this was a band from Berlin when I listened to it the first time, but it did kind of have that Berlin post-punk sound. At least that's what I thought, like in the lineage of some of the bands like Malaria or Ex Mal Deutschland. And I felt like there was some of that 80s EBM influence in there as well. But it's still mixed with that new sound we're getting with a lot of the darkwave acts that we're hearing from these days. The first track, the track I just played, well, I guess it's the second track technically. The first track is just an intro for it, is the more like mainline post-punk song, which doesn't really replicate on the rest of the album. But that's part of the strength of the album, I think, is that it experiments with a lot of different sounds. And I was really into that. There was a lot of, again, that kind of early post-punk just weirdness to trying different genres and just fucking around with stuff. Unfortunately, I was not really into the vocals, though. The singer has that kind of flat, nasally delivery, which I'm sure some people are really into, but it just doesn't do it for me. So that kind of sucked. I was disappointed with that, but overall, I really did enjoy the variety and the unique flavor of the album. And it actually made me wish that it was longer, because I felt like if it had been another 3 tracks, it really would have it would have made for a really robust listening experience. And I feel like it ends too soon, because we only barely get a feel for the band because it switches styles so often. But I still like the experimental elements of it. So for me, out of 5, I'm going to give it a 3.5.
I'm going to give it I'm going to give it a 2. I like the rawness of the sound. That really put me back to the post-punk 80s sound. A lot of music I'm finding, which I like, but it's very slick and produced. So I do like the raw sound of the album. My favorite song was the second one, There's Nothing for You There. I think my problem is, and I do like the variety. Me personally, I'm missing a hook that really draws me in to a song or band, and it's good. Maybe if I was to use this music, I would use it maybe as a background, just for that raw sound. But it missed that hook for me. I wasn't drawn into it. So that's my opinion. 2 stars.
So I kind of have a mix of both of your opinions on it. I did enjoy the album. I thought it was pretty good. And like you, Daniel, one of the things that probably doesn't surprise you that I enjoyed about it was the fact that it was very varied. Yeah. It wasn't a consistent sound the whole way through. And actually one of my least favorite, well, I wouldn't say my least favorite songs, but I didn't actually care for the track 2 that much, just because it was such a standard post-punk song. It wasn't really doing anything new and interesting. True. And I like things that are weird and out there. So that one, I mean, it was a good exercise in post-punk sound. It definitely was very serviceable. Right. I also agree with you, Daniel. I wasn't that thrilled with the vocalist. It was kind of standard goth baritone vocalist number 3. There wasn't a lot of uniqueness to it. There wasn't a lot to distinguish it from other bands. It sort of sounded like another person trying to do Andrew Eldritch a little bit, and that sort of style. And so I didn't necessarily like the ones that had the vocals as present. And then to kind of echo what Das said, one thing I did like about the band and hated about him at the same time was they did a really good job of getting an interesting groove going, but that groove didn't go anywhere. And it didn't ever develop into something that could be interesting. It made it more of a background type of thing. It's like, oh, this song starts, I'm really kind of into this groove. And then it keeps going for 4, 5 minutes without really changing that much. I mean, it's got lyrical content, so the themes and lyrics change over it. But musically speaking, there's not a lot of push and pull, not a lot of dynamism in it. It's the third track was sort of the most disappointing for me in that, because it had this really neat sort of noise collage at the beginning. Then this vibraphone line came in, and it was like, I'm really grooving on this. Where's it going to go? And it just stays with the vibraphone groove the whole way through, which was a cool groove, but I wanted it to do something. I wanted it to go somewhere, rather than just staying there. Right. But one of my favorite tracks, probably the 4th one, the title track. I liked the sort of rockabilly swing thing it had going on there. And he did have the lead singer kind of broke from his vocal style a little bit and had a little bit more expression in it as well. There was a little bit more dynamism in his voice. It still had the same problem where, while it had that really cool rockabilly groove, it didn't necessarily do as much with it as I wanted it to. A lot of these tracks were making me like, I really kind of want to take this track apart and remix it and put some other elements in here and add some new things, which, is one of those things I think about a lot and probably will never do. But that was kind of my feel. I'd say, no, overall, I was pretty positive towards the album, though. So I think I'd probably echo Daniel and go with a 3.5 on that.
So you got to be interested in death. It's the last great taboo. It's the only taboo left.
Precisely. I mean, why is it, do you think, that everyone in here is dressed in black? It's a celebration of death.
No, I just like the clothes.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the clothes look good. Yeah, I mean, death looks good. Charles Manson, yeah? No, he was cool.
Don't know if I mentioned it before, but I'm actually a vampire.
Sinister Suggestions.
So, my sinister suggestion this week is a Netflix special called Sabrina.
Ooh.
If you are familiar, I believe it was a comic first. I never read the comic. I only watched a few episodes of the original sort of comedy show because, well, my parents didn't want me to turn to Satan or whatever stupid shit they were on. But the new one, so the new one is sort of follows the same storyline where it's the half-witch teenager lives with her two aunts, but it is absolutely not a comedy. It's super dark, super very serious. It actually surprisingly touched on a lot of social issues. There's a lot of talk about feminism and intersectionality and that kind of thing, which I thought was fantastic. But the main drive of it is the her becoming a witch and signing her name in the Dark Lord's book, which there's some conflation of like witchcraft and Satanism, which some people my pagan friends have seemed to have a positive reception. I think they kind of get that it's, you know, it's a TV show, so they're going to take some liberties, but it's really good. I would recommend watching the first two episodes. The first two episodes feel like together feel like a feature length film. There's a lot of, it's not slow. It gets right into the story. It's really, really well done. There's tons and tons of gothy atmosphere. It's very dark. It's very spooky. It's just really like what I've been looking for. I watched the first episode of A Haunting of Hill House or whatever the other Netflix thing was, and I was not really into it. It was I don't know if it was too slow or what, but I absolutely recommend checking out at least the first two episodes of the new Sabrina, and then there's 8 more episodes after that if you're into it. But really fun, really dark, perfect for Halloween.
Cool.
Or, you know,
every day.
Yeah. Das, what do you have anything you would want to recommend you've been into this last month?
Yes, I have. I have not heard of this band, and I've been listening to them quite a bit. Called Rendezvous, and
yes.
And looks like they're a French post-punk band formed in 2012. I'm digging this album, Distance. It reminds me very new wave. It reminds me of Devo. A couple of their songs are very Devo-esque, and I love the hell out of that band. So that's what I've been listening to lately. If you like new wave 80s and Devo and that mix of punk, I love it. I'm a big fan of what I'm hearing so far. So yeah, the band Rendezvous, the EP is called Distance.
Yeah, I think I danced to Distance for all of 2017.
Yeah.
It was just that good.
Yeah, I really dug it.
Yeah. What do you got,
coming
Trey?
up a blank, actually. Unfortunately, I did not think of nothing really comes to mind. I mean, I can definitely. I haven't watched Sabrina, but I have lots of friends who have, and I've seen the trailers, and I had some of the same concerns that you'd mentioned. They were doing a lot of, I guess, othering of witchcraft, associating it with Satanism, and also there was a lot of implications that witches are somehow another species and not human to a degree. So I wasn't really comfortable with that. But again, I have a lot of pagan friends, a lot of Wiccan friends. They're enjoying the hell out of it. So it's something that's really piquing their interest despite potential flaws, and maybe seeing full episodes and not just the trailer. Some of that is explained a little bit better, or or maybe they're putting that forward as a way to kind of grab people during the Halloween era or Halloween time to try to grab the mainstream populace with something that is a little bit specially illicit and dark, and they might be playing that up more than it's actually in the show. I don't know.
I would liken it to something like Harry Potter, where there's magic, and maybe it's not as explicit with the witchcraft kind of thing, but it's still understood to be a fantasy world, which I think is what's happening here. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, suspend disbelief. It's not meant to be a totally accurate representation of paganism or witchcraft or Wicca, because it's not as exciting when you're not shooting like lightning bolts out of your fingers or whatever. So, but I think it's a similar along those lines. All right, cool. So, that is that it? I think that's it.
Nice. Yay!
Das, thank you so much for coming on. Remind us where we can find your stuff online.
You can find me on YouTube, Gothic SoulFlower. 2 words. You can also find me on Facebook, Gothic SoulFlower, and also on Instagram. And I am starting. I'm starting to post videos on IGTV. So that means I have to start shooting vertically, which is killing me. But that's where you can find me. And I had fun this evening.
All right, Das, thanks again so much for coming on. It was really a treat to have you. In 2 weeks, we will be back with the long-awaited and teased political episode. We've got a full panel of guests from all different parts of the political spectrum, and we're going to be debating whether or not goth is or should be apolitical. I'll be offering my best arguments defending the apolitical nature of goth, while our guests attempt to pick it apart and tear it down. If you're on Patreon, you already have access to it, but I can say this is going to be an episode you don't want to miss, and it's going to be one of the more interesting episodes we've done. Certainly not the typical circle jerk, as the kids say. This one's going to be a bit contentious, a little bit of friendly back and forth, if you will. Speaking of Patreon, I always like to end our news episodes with a thank you to everyone who supports us on Patreon. We would not exist without your support, and every dollar counts. I really appreciate you guys so much. If you'd like to see what kind of rewards you can get, if you want to hang out in the stream while we record episodes and get some input into the show, if you want early access to episodes, things like t-shirts, live streams, all that kind of good fun stuff, you can head over to patreon.com/cemetery confession. So at the founders level, we have SJ, Esmeralda, Abigail, and Stella. Thank you all so much for your support. At the Nocturnal Council level, we have Kyra, Dawn, Jason, Sarah, Natalie, Michelle, Azzy, Michelle, aka Skullgirdle, Thomas, Trey, Amber, Fifth Dream, Nephilim, Iris, Stevie, Ivy, Mike, William, and Heather. And at the Crow's Call level, we have Esther, Dave, Isabel, Robin, Christina, Such Horrors, Dolly Daggers, Paula, Irene, Becca, Kelly, Isidoro, Sarah Monster, Dom, Michelle, Marco, Alex, Andrew, Crowlin, Stuart, Isabel, Margarita, Christian, Marissa, Jamie, Kimberly, Alex, Shelley, Mr. Polar Bear, Dagger Dance. That one always surprises me for some reason. Caroline, Elena, GPS, Eternal Winter, Bronwyn, David, Angel, Anne, Heather, Honora, Skiamakos, Laurel, Kelly, Joseph, Gopal, Susan, Kay, Beth, and Christine. Those are our Patreon supporters for September. Thank you all so much for supporting this type of content. and allowing us the ability to upgrade and to improve and continue to get the voices of goths from all over the world out there. Thanks again for spending time with me. I will be back, as always, in a couple weeks. So until then, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.